Good morning, and thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium Session 314, titled In Search of a Larger God. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. If you have any questions for our presenter, please type your questions into the Whova app, and they can be addressed during a question and answer period at the end of the session. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation, our presenter wrote, "I used to feel like I needed a bigger church. But behind that need was actually a more fundamental one, the need for a larger God. When my children left Mormonism, they somehow took with them my belief in the Heavenly Father that had been the center of our religious life. Regaining my spiritual footing has required a new kind of faith, a turning away from the confines of what I had been taught and toward what I have seen and lived for myself. In re-envisioning my God, I am reinventing my faith." Our presenter, Susan M. Hinckley, is an artist, writer, and creator of the webcomic Gray Area. She divides her time between Arizona and Minnesota, doting on her children and collection of cacti in one state and grandchildren in the other. I'll give the floor to our presenter.
Thank you, Benjamin. Good morning, and thank you for joining me. It's amazing how nervous you can feel in your own bedroom on a Saturday morning. If you're joining me from West Coast time zone, as a lot of my Arizona friends are, double thanks to you. And I wish that I'd been able to bring donuts for all of you this morning. I am going to open my presentation. When you come to one of my presentations, you're always going to get an experiential treatise rather than an academic one. And where I think the value in what I do lies is that specifically within our culture, we have developed the sort of culture where living off script is not necessarily celebrated, for lack of a better way to say it. And so my hope is, and yet, we all live off script in so many ways. We all do. So my hope is that when I show up and I'm willing to share my own story, I create a little bit of space for your story. I have been having a faith journey, been on a faith journey my entire life, but I've only really been sort of paying attention to it and taking notes for about the past 6 years. If I were to ask the group in this room about your personal relationship with God or how you think about God, I'd probably get as many different answers as people that I asked. If I were to ask you in a church meeting, though, I think that I'd get a lot of less variation in the answers, more carefully scripted answers, kind of the expected things that we all say. And I say this at the beginning, sort of as a quick way to get us all on the same page. That's where my story begins, at that God that you might expect to hear about in the church building. I'm pretty sure that you've all either been there, or if you haven't, you at least know where this place is that I'm talking about. In search of a larger God, reimagining my God and reinventing my faith. We should start at the beginning. Perhaps the problem began with Joseph Smith having seen God as a man. I imagine God would probably show up in the form most likely to be understood by the seeker. So I can't help but wonder whether we may have placed too much stock in that first vision's most concrete details. Was the wonder and mystery of the experience itself tempered by this specific form of God as man, almost to the point of being completely extinguished? And how has this influenced everything that has come since? On my walk one evening, a beautiful moon hung just above the outline of the hills. I was gifted with that illusion where the moon appears to be huge at the horizon, then seems to shrink quickly as it moves into the sky overhead. It wasn't a full moon, but rather my favorite moon, what I call a fingernail moon. Just a sliver, but quite bright. I wasn't even getting the full sliver because there were two clouds in front of it, partially obscuring the bottom of the arc. And the whole thing was so picture perfect, I wasn't sure I'd ever seen a moon in real life that looked quite so much like the moon of an artist's imagination. But it occurred to me as I watched it that part of what made it so wondrous had nothing to do with the moon itself. There was the fact that it appeared larger through a trick of my own eyes and mind. The way I was experiencing it had a lot to do with my perception of it. And those clouds that seemed impossibly perfect in their shape and placement made my experience of it even better. Without the clouds, without it being my favorite kind of moon, the kind of which I can only see a little, without it being near the horizon and my human eyesight doing what it does, it would not have had the same beauty. What remained obscured and what was skewed by my own faulty seeing, those were the things that really gave it value for me. Those were the things that caught my notice. Those were the things that made it a gift. Without that, it might have been any slim moon in any night sky, still shining, still beautiful, but not shining so personally for me. As it climbed, the clouds parted to let it pass, and I could see the rest of a faint circular outline. It became smaller, though still as bright, and it didn't stay lodged in my wonder. It passed through me on its rise, illuminating a dark place briefly, rewarding me for looking up, for pausing to watch, acknowledge, and feel gratitude. Then it went back to just being a moon, and I went about my walk, perhaps larger myself, and a bit lighter. It occurs to me that I've been trained to look for a full moon god, while my heart has yearned for the god of that fingernail moon. The one that appears impossibly large, the one that remains partially hidden in ways that might actually create beauty and meaning for me. The one that doesn't manage to permanently lodge where I can see its fullness, but passes through me in glimpses, giving me just enough to keep me walking. This is the God that speaks in a language I can see, or can't quite. Maybe the whisper of the parts I can't see are what my heart can hear. The still, small voice to which I've been afraid to listen. And that's the funny thing to me about a church that touts a living prophet, as well as an article of faith that says, "And we believe that he will yet reveal many great and important things." It's astounding how resistant we are to change, how distrustful of the parts we cannot see or know, how uninterested in asking big questions, how non-seeking in our lessons and discussions, how fixed in our prayers, how small in our imaginations, how utterly closed, for lack of a better word, we are closed, not truly valuing the outer world or the inner spiritual connection. Our eyes and ears are trained to page and pulpit. Our own adaptation, our own possible surprise or expanding vision do not figure into our collective worldview. When I was a child, a copy of Rembrandt's Night Watch hung over my brother's bed in a gilded frame. It was there for so long, I almost stopped seeing it once I had memorized its every detail. It was fascinating to me, obviously telling some story I did not know and so made up for myself. When I finally went to the Rijksmuseum as an adult and stood before it in wonder, I laughed. At 14 feet 4 inches by 11 feet 11 inches, it bore no resemblance to the small image I'd known like the back of my childhood hand. I was completely overwhelmed at the way I had underestimated this painting, a story that was much bigger than any I could ever have told myself about it. I've never forgotten it coming into view and my realization that what I was seeing was something I had never come close to glimpsing in all my years of looking. I know I'm in the presence of great art, what I call capital A art, rather than run-of-the-mill art, when I get a specific feeling. I started noticing this when I was very young. Sometimes when I would hear music, see a painting, or read a poem, I would experience an expansiveness, like something was calling me to be larger, better, or somehow more. A deep acknowledgement that I was part of something too big to fully grasp, and yet I had a place in it. I knew I wanted to be where that feeling lived. I loved experiencing the magnetic pull of its great secret, feeling there might be more revealed if I could only get to the source. I sensed it in the wonders of nature sometimes too, in impossibly graceful moons or gasping cliffs, in things or places so beautiful they completely transcended man's creative abilities and almost comprehension, things that made even our best attempts at creation seem puny. If I were going to bear my testimony about this feeling, I'd say that after a lifetime of pursuing a testimony in places like scriptures, prayers, and church pews, it turns out I know something is true when it makes me realize everything is bigger than I thought it was. It shouldn't have surprised me that spending all my formative years in a religion of such specific parameters eventually found me beating my head against the sky, begging to understand anything at all beyond the cage. Probably what drives all creative people is this feeling that there's something big they can't quite put their finger on, can't quite capture, so they need to keep trying. I wasn't very old before I started to make and write things myself, always falling woefully short of getting anywhere near that feeling through my own efforts. I had tremendous reverence for it and a desire to possess it, to surround myself with it and keep it with me. But my own creativity didn't seem to have the code. When I looked at anything I made or did, it seemed what I could mostly see was my own small fingerprints all over it. But great art reaches beyond the old towards something new. It clears space. It's only recently that I've begun to perceive that the inner expansion I'd been chasing all my life had nothing at all to do with art or the forces that create it. It had nothing to do with nature itself. The expansiveness I felt was the manifestation of God, the pull of deep wonder. And the yearning was my need for a larger one than the one I had been given as a child, the one with whom I'd been trying to have a relationship, but never quite succeeding. Perhaps I needed a bigger God. I had to come to this big realization, though, through a much smaller and more painful one. I had to begin by understanding that in addition to needing a bigger God, or maybe as a result of that need, I needed a bigger church. Something larger than the one I'd been raised in, and in which I'd raised my children. And that was the key. It was in raising my children in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that my need for what I didn't find there was exposed again and again. Until finally, it expressed itself, or I guess I should say my beloved daughters expressed it for me, in their leaving it. Of course, from their very first day, my children bore the fingerprints of hands much larger and more mysterious than my own. Though they have turned out to be imperfect people, just like the rest of us, from the moment they arrived, I experienced them as a bright and perfect vision, a glimpse of God's great secret, teaching me in ways I'd never been taught before. I learned from them that the creative act brought me more personal connection with God, or with something I could perceive as God, than any other approach I had tried. I first sensed the seeds of divinity in myself by seeing those seeds clearly in them. I also realized that my love as a parent and my yearning for relationship with my children didn't feel exactly like the relationship I'd grown up envisioning my Heavenly Father having with me. The things I'd been taught were most important to Heavenly Father weren't important enough to stand between my daughters and my love. So this heavenly vision that answered some of my deepest questions also revealed a gaping personal lack of any real God knowledge. Joseph Campbell said, "The image of God is your final obstruction to a religious experience." I was looking for messages from God, but these deep, painful love lessons from my children kept presenting themselves to me instead. And somehow, I didn't trust the messengers enough to easily open myself to learning them. There were things I had to unlearn first. I had to untangle my expectations from my reality, my faith from my belief, my relationships from my Mormonism. I'm hardly the first person to raise children and then feel wounded when they walked away into their own lives in a direction different from the way I'd been pointing. We're meant to find our own way, and heaven knows I've made a lot of noise about my right to do as I please all my life. But knowing that going in didn't lessen my strange grief when they did it. Many children shed the traditions of their fathers, but I think we always hope that our own might pick it up again. After all, they can live with piles of dirty clothes on the floor as teenagers, dropping things casually on their way from the door to the bed, and then stepping over them for days after. But a mother always trusts that eventually they'll become tired of living that way and decide to pick things up for themselves. My daughters did the dropping part, but in this thing, it doesn't appear likely that there will be any picking up. They shrugged off the blanket God we'd spent decades wrapping them in so carefully and left it on their childhood floor, closing the door behind them. This was something I didn't know how to reconcile, to address with them, with myself, or with the Heavenly Father I was supposed to know. At the time, it was a tear in the fabric of my mother universe so violent, it felt irreparable and unfair, unexpected, and deeply personal. Even as it was understandable on a logical level, knowing them as I did, it somehow felt inconceivable on a spiritual one. And these feelings their choice brought to my surface were shocking. I was as unprepared for my own emotional response to their leaving as I was for the leaving itself. I found myself unequipped to deal with it on just about every level. They obviously needed something different from what I'd given them. I needed something different from what I'd been given too, but I'd allowed the gnawing to grow inside myself rather than let my hunger out in pursuit of actually being filled. Not finding satisfaction from my spiritual life had, in a twisted way, become a hallmark of it. A sort of plausible deniability in which it didn't really matter whether I possessed any truth about God or not, as long as God knew I'd spent my life working off the approved checklist. So my kids shrugging off my version of God probably wasn't an actual rejection of any specific spiritual relationship so much as my failure to really sell the importance of the list. I'd given them plenty of what I had, but how could I give them what I didn't possess or even understand that I wanted? And now, what good was a church that was not big enough to hold my own beautiful children? Without my family, the box I'd expected to always contain our shared God felt hollow, echoing and suffocating all at once. Richard Rohr writes that God is always bigger than the boxes we build for God, so we should not waste too much time protecting the boxes. It seemed I'd invested a lifetime in preparing the box, only to find that what I assumed was inside maybe wasn't there at all. Once my children left the God box we'd all lived in, they somehow took everything I recognized as God with them. The vacuum their departure created sucked all the godness out of my careful box, and I found myself alone, unable to breathe there. Did I never really know God, after all? What about my decades of careful observance? My willingness to swallow big questions rather than endanger myself and everyone around me by speaking them out loud? Suddenly, I felt I'd been gasping at God's straws forever, knowing all along they probably couldn't save me. Had my own potential ability to experience the divine in the way my spirit yearned to, as large and small and mysteriously both personal and universal, been hampered by the box that my religion built? A result of one man's very specific experience of God? A box I'd not only been willing to accept on faith, but had spent a lifetime trying to make in some way my own? What about the fact that I'm a woman, whose woman God never quite materializes in our theology? She's nodded to, but never revealed in any detail at all. A character veiled in reverent rumor, desired by many, but existing in hush and shadow. The truest line in the Bible for me has always been that Mary kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. It speaks deeply to my own experience. I realized as a young girl that I might have to look harder, if only because I was not reflected in the God mirror held up for me by religion. Yet I knew creativity was inseparable from God, knew that the world in all its diverse beauty was born even before the man, and that women continue God's sacred and powerful creative work, even if it, inexplicably to me, never earns the label of a priesthood. And what about the testimonies of truth and the wonders of beauty? What about the testimonies of truth, the wonders and beauty of this world had borne to me from the time I was a child? What if I'd gotten God all wrong, pursuing an idea that could never satisfy because it was never really mine to begin with? What about the sacred truth of my own experience? Is it possible that in my entire spiritual life, I had never given myself permission to look, to see God in and for myself, afraid that what might be revealed could violate the agreed upon blueprint with no hope of ever fitting in the box at all? I had to go back to the beginning. I didn't know another place to start. I was born of goodly parents, a mother who never doubted, and a father who I think perhaps did, but kept his questions carefully tucked in a drawer, the exact contents of which his children were never allowed to see. Sometimes I heard it, though, opening and closing quietly as if in the next room. I'm comforted by the idea that there are things about my parents I don't know. It's a bit of truth that calls some of the things I think I do know into question, a dynamic I like when it comes to discussing religion. Going back further into my personal pre-existence, there are pioneers and polygamy, the gods that made me. People who gave everything to building up the kingdom, or at least Utah County. Devoted men who went to prison rather than renounce their plural wives. Relief Society presidents, hands-on women of legend who quilted in community, planned bazaars, and blessed the sick. From this stalwart Mormon stock descended my tribe of aunts and uncles and cousins who kept family group sheets, gathered for Sunday dinners and summer reunions, and across the generations, prayed to a common God. I have no idea why I seem so completely skeptical about my first Easter basket. I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps I was born with a prove it look on my face. I don't know. In my childhood home, we did all the things a Mormon family might, living in the Salt Lake City of the 1970s. We went to church morning and afternoon, and so kept our dresses on all day. We had family home evening and family prayer. We read the Book of Mormon together, carefully underlined the important parts in red. We had robust discussions of principles like justice and mercy at the dinner table, gossiped about ward members in equal measure, sang our beloved hymns together in the car, participated in road shows and sacred ordinances with the same religious zeal. Our church, family, and community lives were all of a piece, seamlessly woven into the kind of durable fabric you'd be more likely to mend than throw out if it ever did happen to develop a hole. As a natural questioner, I've wondered how I accepted my family's shared version of God without asking too many questions out loud. It's uncharacteristic behavior for me, so as a child, I must have deeply needed or wanted the comfort that the sturdy, stable Mormonism of my heritage delivered. It's safe to say that I never really considered building my life on any other template. I tell you this story because I continue to search it myself, wondering how it's possible to have spent a lifetime immersed in church without ever glimpsing the true scope of God's love. It was easy to be in that life, though, without always remembering God was the point of it all. People were there for all kinds of reasons, probably still are, but some of the infrastructure that kept people coming, whether they cared much about finding God or not, doesn't really exist anymore. Things like church basketball tournaments, dance festivals, and midweek homemaking workshops formed the framework of neighborhood life. Some people were having deeply spiritual experiences, I'm sure, but I was a kid, and the other stuff kept me busy enough that I didn't stop to wonder whether or not the doctrine of my church could sustain me for a lifetime. Without ever saying it out loud, at some point, I realized that Mormons generally assumed God to be one of them. I have yet to say this to anyone without having them initially dismiss it as a ludicrous, if not blasphemous, simplification, but upon thinking about it, it's hard to make any other argument. If the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is regarded by its members as God's official church upon the earth, that makes God a Mormon. But isn't our church life really only part of this human experience? And if God is a Mormon, and Mormonism could not hold my children in this life, would its God hold them in the next? Thomas Merton wrote, "The life of the soul is not knowledge, it is love." So what are we doing with our declared knowledge, our collective belief? Some Sundays I see glimmers of the God I yearn for, but many Sundays are what I've come to describe as small God Sundays. A good example happened recently when a Relief Society teacher began a lesson by saying, "We all know love is important, but..." The rest of the lesson focused on everything that came after the but. That was disappointing since the part that spoke truth to my heart came before it. Looking around the room, I wondered whether I was alone in my discomfort, whether anyone else needed more or, like me, significantly less. So often what is missing for me in our religion is everything that cannot be said, that peace-giving space where we need not know any more than this moment and the people with whom we are in it. In that immediate place, knowledge is replaced by hope, which I find to be much more reliable, and how I live becomes a decision made to improve things here and now, one made out of love and not with an eye always trained on gilding my eternity. My life can be an exercise in love, and my God can be allowed to love without a lot of additional rules and regulations that quantify a child's worthiness or God's willingness. I have a friend who is fond of saying that, for all she knows, God may actually end up being a talking rock. And that would be okay with her, and with me. I think about that all the time, the truth that not knowing somehow suits me better than knowing would, and how ill-fitting my religion is for a woman who prefers the God question to the God answer. All I really do need at this point is for God to be bigger than anything I'm able to get my puny head around. A talking rock would be as good a surprise as any other, the joke being on us because we've made all kinds of silly human-based assumptions about a divinity that exists beyond our comprehension. That's what I hope for. That's what speaks promise to me. Please let God be bigger and more mysterious than a man. So what do I need or want to know now? Going back to the beginning meant an assessment of what I do know of God, or would want to be true anyway, if I could know the truth. the kinds of traits that are important to me but no one talks about on Sunday. Having spent a lifetime in church, it turns out that most everything I believe about God, I didn't learn there at all. I learned it doing things like walking at night and wondering at moons, like getting my hands dirty in pursuit of ideas I can never quite express. I learned it from a love for my children so big, it came out of seemingly nowhere to fill parts of me I never knew existed. And yet it came out of me. That must teach me something. They were my own first vision, the thing that continues to inform and enlarge everything that has come since. I know it is true. As surely as Joseph believed his own eyes, I trust my mother heart. But it didn't teach me everything. I continue to learn from living in the world, being willing to look around while I do. So much is made plain in the seeing. God likes diversity. God made giraffes as well as ducks, intending them to live completely different lives, and didn't stop there. God enjoys a good joke. What other explanation could there be? God is no respecter of persons. Go ahead, try applying a merit-based system to human beings. See? God is patient. God uses drops of water to carve canyons. Any artist willing to engage in that kind of process work isn't in a hurry. God is okay with imperfection. There doesn't seem to be anything perfect on this earth, so it seems God was particularly obvious with this lesson. God is not a control freak. Stuff happens, and so much of it. God intends to surprise us. Is there anything in a life that goes exactly the way we thought it would? God is doing complex mathematics. I had a grandfather who only went to 8th grade, but could see the answers to complicated math problems just by looking at them. This didn't make him at all helpful with homework. Knowing the answer didn't mean he could show us how to do it. God is doing math we just don't understand. God is interested in the human story. Each of us is allowed our own, to be told in any language or with no words at all. The whole point of God's Son coming to earth must be to assure us that our story is understood. These are a few of the simpler things I've noticed, and there is surely much more than meets my small eye. I've heard it said that we can only know God through an open mind, just like we can only see the sky through a clear window. We won't see the sky if we've covered the glass with blue paint. The idea of painting the sky on a window before we look out, so it appears exactly the way we want it to, or think it should, or hope it will, sounds silly. Yet sometimes, when I'm sitting in church surrounded by what feels and sounds like certainty about ideas that for me only point to larger questions, I have the vague feeling I'm looking at a painted sky. It's pretty, sunny, warm, and reliable, but if I could somehow just scrape away the blue paint, I might get a glimpse of what the sky really looks like. And if I were to open the window and lean out, I might see further. When I think of the God about which I've spent my life learning, and the church in which I've learned, I see human fingerprints all over both of them. That's okay. Even the greatest, most inspiring art in the world is created using human hands. It isn't given to us by miracle, but requires trial and error, patience, the disappointment of false starts, and the humility of beginning again. Like people building a tower to the sky, or a box meant to hold all the answers of eternity, I feel we have inevitably fallen short. How would we not? A God defined by committee is an exercise bound to miss the mark. Forming a church from the ground up would inevitably require tempering of the individual imagination. It would become the product of agreement by compromise, marked by the fingerprints of politics, personal opinion and personality, social and cultural change. Practical considerations and questions would require specific answers. Things some might prefer to leave unexpressed would be written down. The small t truths of one might be given a capital T in the testimony of another. An idea as big and unwieldy as God must be made more manageable if it is ever to be packaged. And the result of all this truth wrangling, of men's insistence on taking charge of and organizing the unknowable, is that those leading the church's way have somehow arrived at a God from which I sometimes struggle to feel any expansive, godlike pull at all. Yet no matter how often or how explicitly the official version is spelled out for me by someone else, my experience insists on a God that loves me as much as I love my own children. I need a church that is big enough for me, for them, and everyone else who might want to be here, a God large enough to hold us all. I want to be rid of boxes altogether, to be free to see what is made obvious to me, to learn from my own experiences, to honor my own vision, to follow the magnetic pull of a huge, overwhelming love wherever I feel it, to find peace in finally naming and knowing it for myself. I want this God whose faint, full outline I've only now begun to see, the God of the fingernail moon, who doesn't take away the darkness, but affords me a slit of bright hope against it, one graceful ray of promise shining from a crack in the next room. The glimpse is enough. Life is nothing but mystery, as I have experienced it, at least the memorable parts, the encounters that urge us to grow, teach us about ourselves, about love and our own place in a universe too big to comprehend, but of which we are somehow an important part. I am continually blindsided and bewildered, but also amazed beyond my capacity to hold my own wonder. If I don't have a God big enough to encompass all of the actual dimensions of my personal human experience, with a lot left over so that I can put trust in something larger than my tiny understanding can grasp, where can my mind rest? It has been unable to find rest in a box so small it doesn't seem to hold everything I have right now. So I turn away from the confines of what I have been taught, God recreated in the language and pictures of someone else's vision, and toward what I have seen and lived for myself. Going back to the beginning required me to peer into my own darkness with a willingness to really see. I've had to learn new words, try new ways of listening. I've had to search new scriptures, say new prayers, dare to ask different questions than the ones I've asked before. I've had to clear space for myself, to stop pretending to knowledge I don't need or even want, to allow growth in the places I've kept small. The secret to being reached may reside in becoming reachable. The secret to finding a larger God may be looking everywhere all the time, seeing a sacrament in the ordinary because the ordinary points to the universal truth. Accepting that the whole world is a holy place and being ready to take off your shoes and stand, allowing God to exist in even the most mundane or imperfect moments. I have a poem that speaks to this. Babel. God speaks to us in any language we can understand. God in birds, in trees, in wind, tall grass, its whisper and its bend. God in pie, if it's the kind my grandma made. God in the dishwater slipping through her hands after we were filled. God in the suns and in the song she hummed. Listen. Can a new God be found when you're sitting in the same old church? I believe the answer is yes. We all conjure God for ourselves. We all tell God slant, as Emily Dickinson might say, an amalgamation of our own hopes, beliefs, and experiences. Joseph Smith arrived with his version first. We accept that and then tweak it a little to make it feel more personal. So it wouldn't really require anything new except an acknowledgement that by going back to the beginning, reimagining my personal slant from scratch, I'm at risk of being surprised by what comes, and I'm willing to take that risk. It's not unlike a blindfolded pin the tail on the donkey. It could be, when the blindfold is removed, that we've all had a good chuckle at the things we've been confused about or gotten wrong. The tail hung on the donkey's eye or dangling from a hoof, or even stuck on the bathroom door, having missed the donkey altogether and wandered down the hall. There's a scene at the end of the old movie, Little Big Man, in which an aged Indian chief, well known for his visions of things to come, is talking to God at the end of his life. His eyes have long failed him, yet he says, "Thank you for my vision and the blindness in which I saw further." Following our questions, walking with our doubt, is probably more important than getting it right 100% of the time. Walking forward anyway reflects a larger, braver kind of vision that sight does not require. It reflects hope. It does no good to have definitive answers when the point of the test is to see how well you can do without them. The older I get, the more sorry I feel that I've spent my life distrusting my spiritual instincts. I've been robbed, even if that is in large part by myself. Who wants to seek when they fear that what they find may be unacceptable? But I have a hunch and a hope. If I were able to have a conversation with Joseph, I might find him to have exactly the ingredient, genuine spiritual curiosity, that I often, sitting in a small God lesson that seems an endless loop of the same few ideas and approaches, find the religion he founded to lack. That hope is meaningful to me. In Mormonism, the big spiritual experience, conversion, is to receive knowledge that the church is true. Personal experience with the divine is not celebrated or necessarily even welcomed unless it strengthens the existing box of accepted doctrine. The idea of legislating belief in one man's God fails me as often as I try to make sense of it. Taking a room full of people and laying out a list of acceptable beliefs, then asserting that if they ask sincerely, identical beliefs will distill upon each of their minds, seems precisely the same as assuring a group that they can believe in Santa Claus if only they will try hard enough. Under the Santa Claus scenario, once that belief is gone, I find it difficult to imagine that it could ever be reclaimed, even by those with the most sincere and ardent desire to do so. However, and this is a big however, I have no problem imagining a room full of people who remain devoted to the idea of Santa Claus, find meaning and hope in his spirit of giving, and strive to internalize it, and wish to raise their children with Santa as the centerpiece of a Christmas morning gifting tradition, remembering fondly the remarkable ways their belief informed their own experiences. The idea of Santa Claus is appealing long after you've stopped believing. And a room full of people devoted to it could exist very peacefully, so long as no one stood up and announced that if you no longer held a literal belief in Santa, you didn't belong in the room. If faith is a living thing, there will be many among us whose beliefs will shift. Our pews should extend to welcome those who no longer believe in exactly the way they once did, but still find personal meaning in our traditions. Emphasis on an ongoing restoration would suggest the most open of windows, the most seeking of minds and hearts. How can you define belief in the context of things you openly acknowledge not knowing? Is it enough to accept those things as your partner on this earthly journey and walk forward anyway? We're here for the walking part, after all, to see how well we do it, how long we're willing to keep putting one spiritual foot in front of the other and go where it leads us. To ask our big questions and then move our feet in the direction we feel we ought to go if we ever wish to find the answers demonstrates a belief in the value of the question itself. It's worth making the journey whether or not we get to an answer. In fact, it's worth making it our life pursuit. Finding a sure relationship with God, then passing it off successfully to our children must not be the main thing we're meant to accomplish on earth. The point must be what we do with our not knowing. I seek a seat in the church where I can not only look out the open window, but also describe what I see. I intend to find one. I want to walk through the world open-eyed too, gathering God in all ways and places, ideas and faces, to bring with me when I come to worship. Even if I can't create a church big enough to hold my unique family, I can invite God to create in me a more expansive faith, a personal faith with room enough to hold all the things I know and the things I don't know yet. The small part I see, the faint outline of something much bigger. So much of my life has been given to control, trying to control myself, trying to control others, trying to control outcomes, trying to control God, trying to control it all through my own righteous actions and desires, but also chafing against the constraints of a religion that taught me falsely to think perhaps I could. What I need from a relationship with God is someplace in my life where I can cede control. That would be rest to me. That would be the promised peace at last, the rock of my salvation. I have a deep spiritual longing for something so large and mysterious, I can't possibly control it, so I don't need to worry about trying. It's just not within my small white knuckle grasp. It's not within my actions, nor even within the capabilities of my mind. Math too complex for me to see the answers, even if I'm able to show a lifetime of my own work. This is what I want now, a set of questions with answers too endless to fit in any box, so our default answer is love. In re-envisioning my God, I am reinventing my faith. Beginning again, searching for a larger God meant searching for a larger self. God didn't need to change, my own heart and mind did. I needed to stop protecting the box to discover endless room for truth. Attentive as I walk, alert to the smallest glimpses, the faintest whisper and pull, I feel my anxious heart relaxing into a larger spiritual home. It's right here where I've always lived, yet I can see the outline of something much bigger. A vision at last my own, love truer and brighter than I have seen before. Hope enough to keep me walking. Thank you.
And thank you, Susan. That was wonderful. We actually do have quite a few comments and questions for you.
Okay, I'm happy to take those.
And this is a really neat comment. The highest rated comment is, I am so amazed by this that I cannot even contemplate a question.
Oh. I wonder if that's from my best friend. If not, whoever you are, thank you.
Here's a good question for you, though. Do you feel comfortable enough to express your thoughts of a larger God with other members of the LDS Church? There can be a guilt when we speak our own truth to those who aren't in the same place.
There not only can be a guilt, there can be a crushing burden of guilt that keeps you silent in your seat for 50 years, which would be my own experience. It's extraordinarily difficult in the culture that we have created. And I have had to make the choice for myself. You know, a lot of people describe having had a faith crisis, and I describe myself as having had a silence crisis. I simply could not continue to carry the burden of my own silence and attend church. I couldn't do it anymore, and I had to start speaking. And for me, that magically, or I'm not sure who was behind it, but it coincided with a calling to Teacher Relief Society. And I had to make the choice in that moment that if I were going to do it, I was being given the opportunity to finally say some of the things that I needed to say to the people that I needed to hear it. Because you can spend all your life online talking to like-minded others, other people who feel disenfranchised by our church and in our culture, or people who have, experienced a faith crisis and eventually a faith shift of some kind of their own. But if you can't say it to the people who are sitting in the pews with you, it doesn't have the same kind of, it doesn't provide the same kind of relief and the same kind of growth in your own journey, in my experience. So I needed to be able to say those things. And I have found a way to do it. However, you know, you have to be strategic. You have to be very careful. You have to be willing to speak in the shared language of Mormonism so that you don't alienate people and that they'll continue to listen. You don't, you know, you can't marginalize your own voice immediately by the things that you say. It does require a certain degree of compromise in order to do that. I've been willing to do it. Some people are unable to do that. They don't find the authenticity that they seek, perhaps, or, you know, something else. They've just had enough of being silent and can't be anymore. I have been willing to do it because, you know, we all have our own personal relationship to the church, what it does in our lives, what we want from it, and what relationship we want going forward from it. And for me, weighing it, it has been worth the compromises that I've needed to make. But I'm definitely finding ways to speak to a larger audience. And I'm continually amazed by how often, if I'm willing to open my mouth and plant some kind of clue that, you know, I'm thinking outside the box just a little, people will step into that space. Because the truth that I'm learning is that so many of us are thinking outside the box, even while we're sitting inside the box. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. How would you describe your personal spiritual practice? Have you been drawn to other spiritual traditions outside modernism?
I have not explored other spiritual traditions outside Mormonism. My personal spiritual practice at this point, well, there have been a few specific things that I've tried while I've been kind of trying to reconnect myself with God, sort of separate from my relationship with God that I came to through Mormonism. I had to sort of find a new relationship. And so I had to do some things in order to do that. And one of them, people may have heard me talk about before, I took on a challenge to myself to begin writing prayers, and I would write a prayer every day, and they were addressed to whom it may concern. I had to sort of eliminate even the idea that I knew where those prayers were going. I wanted them to fly into the universe completely unfettered by any of my preconceived ideas or the things that I'd been taught. And so I spent a month doing that every day. There was no prayer language in them. They were the conversations that I needed to have and the things that I needed to say. And there was something really magic in that for me. It changed the way that it just sort of fundamentally shifted the way that I think about God. The hard part about that exercise was giving myself permission to do it. And sort of once I overcame that by giving myself new permission every day for a whole month, once I kind of got through that barrier, things shifted for me, that I felt I was able to give myself wider permission in other areas. But for me, my most reliable spiritual practice is walking at night, which I described in this paper. I do walk at night, and I do it consistently, and it is a meditative time for me. I walk in a place where I don't, my feet know the path so well, I don't really need to pay attention to the walking part. I'm free to use that time to do things like look at the moon and try specifically to connect with God, not always so much in words, but in my heart. And that has been transformational for me.
You reminded me, of course, of the hymn, I Wander Through the Still of Night.
Yes, very much like that. Actually, I call it vespering. It's my personal word for it. I go vespering at night. It's my nighttime religious devotion.
That's lovely. Here's another question. I, as a person drawn to math and science, have also found a need for a larger God. Have you found many others in your life that need a larger God?
I find it, I'm finding it, I spend a lot of time in online spaces with people who are on similar journeys to mine. And so, of course, I find it there. It's a very common refrain that I hear there. But I also find it, curiously, among people that I would describe as very Orthodox members. And I'm so often surprised by, where I see evidence of this in the things that people say and the things that they're struggling with. It was one of the remarkable things about the sisters in my ward that I have worked with in my Relief Society calling is when we started, I got the impression that they had very little trust in their own spiritual authority. And as I have gone deeper with them over the 6 years, because I've had the privilege of doing this calling for a long time, as we have sort of built a relationship of trust in talking about spiritual things, I have realized that, that they're as hungry for a personal relationship with these things as I am, and that many of them, their lives have led them down the same difficult and unexpected and difficult to reconcile paths that mine has. And if I'm willing to give them permission to talk about things and to sort of take a step towards seizing some of that spiritual authority openly, they're willing to do it. So I think it's out there among people who are struggling, but also among many people who would not consider themselves to be struggling. Like I said, I think we're all on a faith journey. I think we're on a faith journey all our lives. We are if we're doing it right anyway, right? Faith is not meant to be a static position where we just land and stay for eternity. So giving people permission to join you in your exploration, to me, has revealed many more people than I expected.
We have a question along those lines as well. They say, I have realized recently that I believed that God's love was only able to manifest itself to me when I am obedient. Did you have a similar experience? And how have you unlearned this?
Well, here's the thing. I am not I never met a rule that I liked in my whole life. I was absolutely born that way, with pretty much complete disdain for authority of any kind. I have very willful children who I see exactly where that came from for them, because it's part of my natural wiring. And so I know there are many people who step into this space after a lifetime of having felt, this intense need to be obedient. I am one of those people who has instead felt an intense desire to not be obedient, and yet was obedient. And so, somehow giving myself permission to sort of go off script in ways that I'm trying to think of the best way to say. I don't want to alienate anyone in this answer. I want everyone to feel okay with this answer. But my rebellions have been more personal rebellions, I guess. And I feel like they've sort of always been that way, only now I'm getting much louder about them. And that has been healing for me. I know there are other people who need to, I don't even want to use the word rebel here, but need to change their behaviors in different ways, and sort of be released from the fetters of the obedience that has guided their lives to this point. And I have respect for any way in which someone needs to change the rules for themselves and mix it up in order to reconstruct and reinvent something that is more meaningful and personally fulfilling for them spiritually. So I guess that would be my answer to that question.
It looks like we've really only got time for one more question, as we're really coming to the end. And there's many more, so I hope that we will engage on the Whova app, and that maybe you can answer a few more questions there. But I want to ask this one last one. They say, all three of my parents' children went inactive, yet they have remained devout. You speak of how your daughter's experience called you to change your views. What, if any, seeds of doubt or unorthodoxy might have already been in place so that your daughter's leaving became the last straw?
That's interesting to me that someone could listen to that presentation and not assume that I was born carrying an enormous burden of seeds of doubt. Doubt has always sort of been the default for me, actually. So I'm not sure how my daughter's leaving became the last straw, except to say that I think it felt so personal to me because, I had been operating in spite of my doubt for my whole life. I had carried that burden of doubt and yet, made these choices to stay and to devote myself to something that, I fundamentally had real doubts about. And so for them to feel the freedom to leave it when it no longer served them. That was, I think that's part of why that was so personal and so hurtful for me in a way. I don't know another word to it. It was painful. I don't know another way to describe it. Of course, that was a problem that I had. That was my problem, not their problem. But yeah, anyway, thank you everyone for attending. And if you do want to discuss further or you have questions, please feel free to email me at susanmhinkley@gmail.com, susanmhinkley@gmail.com, or on the Whova app. I will try to interact and respond with all of you. I really appreciate you showing up this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to all who attended and for supporting Sunstone. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions today.
Thanks, Benjamin.